Shortly before the pandemic, the back area of the food bank was beginning to emerge as an area of priority for us. So, back around 2018, 2019, we were beginning to grow more vegetables back there. Mike Bloxham, one of our staff members, had set up some raised beds there that volunteers could come in and garden in. And we had another volunteer named Chuck, and he'd been around a long time. He knew his stuff, and he was growing a number of vegetables and other things in the back area. One day he and I were talking, and I was complimenting him on how well the plants and other things were coming along. And he had looked at me at that time and said, look, if you had a greenhouse back here, you could do a lot more growing. And he said, and it could happen year round, but it would remove us from the inclemental weather and enable us to be able to grow more. So, I kept that in my mind, and ruminated on it for a while. And then came the pandemic. And when that happened, as we've mentioned many times before, everything began to change. And we realized we had to start making some changes in order to meet with the challenges that were out there. And we need to keep in mind too that just prior to this, we were helping a lot of people with food and with hampers, but the public was giving more and more, and so were companies, of fresh food, those kind of things that were perishable, but which were of great value to people who were coming to us for help. So we realized we were on part of that upswing even before the pandemic came. So I kept that in my mind, and I talked it over with Jane, mentioned it briefly at a couple of board meetings about the back area and other things. And then I remember the pandemic hit, and CBC, Rebecca Zenbergen, had me on the radio one morning and wanted to talk about what the food bank response was going to be in light of this. They had heard that we were going to remain open and help all the different agencies. And it was pretty amazing. CBC understood that, whatever happens at the food bank is going to have an impact on the community. So they rightfully wanted to know what our plans were. The problem was it had only just begun. We were doing our best to try to figure out where this was going. But I think the majority of us living in London really had no idea what was going to happen next. But we had to organize around that uncertainty the best we could. And I remember speaking with Rebecca about how it was very hard now that the pandemic was here because of people that were food insecure. The food supply chains were broken. There were real difficulties. Agencies were limiting their operations or had closed altogether. And I said that part of what we were trying to do was to provide more perishable, value-driven food to people that were coming to us, but also to agencies. And I just mentioned in the course of the interview that one of the things that I'd been toying about in my head was the idea of a greenhouse for the rear of the food bank. She asked what was going on back there, and I reminded her that the food bank is actually built on a garbage dump. It was a garbage dump for that Glencairn area, that part of London, and although it had been, stopped being used years and years and years ago, that land was still there, and the food bank was situated on that land. That presented particular environmental problems as far as how deep down you could dig or those kind of things. But overall, we got along fine as a food bank. It didn't stop our growing of produce in the back, and it was all good. But then I remember, as I said to Rebecca about the greenhouse, she was intrigued and said, how would that work? I told her I had no idea. I'd never run a greenhouse before. I'd never built a greenhouse before. Of course, I'd seen lots of them like we all have. I didn't know quite how they worked, but I said I was pretty determined to think about, now that the pandemic was here, how we could use this occasion to start using that back area in a far more productive way than we were. And we closed off the interview, and by the time I said goodbye to Rebecca and was just walking out the door, my cell phone rang, so I shut the door, and I was just outside of it, and it was a prominent Londoner who headed a prominent London organization. He said, Glenn, I was listening to you live on CBC. I really like the idea of the greenhouse. I don't know anything about them, but I want to make a large donation towards it. I hadn't even left the building yet, and that started happening. By the time I came back home, I'd already had a number of messages from all sorts of different people, who, some prominent, some people I didn't know, but many from just average Londoners who had their own guards and everything else, that really wanted us to know that this was a good way to go and that they would support it in any means that they could. And so I was intrigued. So I began looking at how to go ahead now. Don't forget the pandemic was here. We didn't know quite. We knew that it would be situated in the back, but there was all sorts of zoning issues, all those kind of things that we had to do. And also, what kind of greenhouse would we get? Well, we discovered that glass ones were hugely expensive. But what's called a hoop house, that is with metal frames, metal girders covered with 2 sheets of plastic, those kind of things were possible. But I needed help. So I reached out to 2 people that I felt were really essential. One was John Fleming. Now, John was the head of planning for the City of London. He had been responsible and one of the chief architects for the London plan that had come out just a few years before. He had just retired. I met him, and I'd known him for years. I met him for coffee at a Tim's on Springbank Drive, and I mentioned that I was going to do this, and why doesn't he come along and help out? He was just at a stage of his life where he was looking for something to do, but the pandemic was limiting options. So I said, yeah, I'll come along, I'll help. So he did. And he took us through a lot of that stuff. He's really good at doing research and surveying, all that kind of stuff as to what's needed in a community. That was a big help. The second thing is I met a man at that time named Luis Reyes. Now, Luis is from Chile, but he'd been trained in horticulture. He knew about greenhouses. He had a choice between going to Switzerland or Newfoundland once he left Chile, and he wanted to work in greenhouses, and he ended up in Newfoundland. Now, a lot of us don't think of greenhouses in Newfoundland, but when you do consider it, it kind of makes sense. It's not easy to grow there. So you need to extend the growing seasons by whatever possible means you can. Anyway, he left there and he came to London. I met him one day and I said, Luis, would you be willing to help us to get this thing going? So really, it was the 3 of us. We sat, we commiserated, we talked about how we would go about it. But John, with his expertise on city regulations and all those things, and Luis had vast knowledge about greenhouses, which I was not fully aware of at first, we decided that we would go ahead, get the land surveyed, we would grade it so that water would move off well. We would also plant some trees in the area using Reforest London and other groups. So anyway, we decided that we would go ahead. It was one of the most remarkable experiences of my life. Luis knew what he was doing. John and I had no idea about greenhouses, but we moved ahead and we scoped them out and we looked what was available. And by the time we'd finished doing all that research, we'd found somebody who supplied these greenhouses. Now, this greenhouse that we have at the moment is 30 feet wide by 15 feet high and 70 feet long. So it's fairly large, and it occupied most of the area of the back part of the food bank. So we went ahead and ordered it and got it. I went to the board and said that this is what I was interested in doing. I had really professional help to get that stuff done. So they gave the go-ahead to do it, and also money was flowing in. I mean, the London Free Press had heard about a greenhouse that we were considering and did an interview on that. So there was a lot of interest. So people began donating towards it. Others really wanted to donate their time. They really thought that during a pandemic, this would give them a chance to be outside, but also in a more protected area, which made sense. So we were trying to field all of those requests. But I'll tell you, how do you build a greenhouse? And how do you build a greenhouse on a piece of property that you're not really allowed to dig down into in order to provide a foundation for the greenhouse, when it used to be a garbage dump and you weren't allowed to dig down into that area? So it was a problem. But anyway, we finally decided to put it just on the surface, and we would put spikes into the ground that would hold it there, and that is the way we went. Now, to get help, we had help from a great London fellow who lived just outside the city, who helped us to grade the ground so that the water drained off at the best level. And we also got a group called Leuna, which is really a construction union here in town that trains and does apprenticeship with people. They've been around a long time. They had been partners with the food bank since almost the beginning. They'd helped us to put in shelves and those other things. So I approached a fellow named Brandon McKinnon, who headed that area. He's like, we're building a greenhouse. Is there any chance that you could help us to do so? So he came right along, course, it was a pandemic, and he was looking for things for his people to do. He said, "We'll be there." So they all showed up one day. The greenhouse kit came in, and we began to assemble it and began to put it together. It wasn't as easy as you might think, but really, LiUNA really came through. I mean, they were pretty amazing, and they helped us to set up the girders. I got some great videos from those days. This was their first greenhouse as well, so they were learning. We were all looking at directions and trying to figure it out. And then I remember it was all up, and we just so much appreciated what LiUNA did. They sent us 3 or 4 folks over the course of a few weeks, and the girders were all set up. And we sent them on their way with huge thanks because they'd been so great to us over the decades. So anyway, then it was up to John and Luis and I one Saturday morning to figure out how we're going to put the plastic tarp over the greenhouse. How do you do that with something that's 15 feet high and is sloped like this? Anyway, we kind of figured out. It was a great day. It probably took us 3 hours in the end. We had to tie the end of the plastic to ropes and tennis balls. This was Luis's idea. Tied it to tennis balls, and we threw it over the girders that were there. And then we went around the other side and began to pull, and we lifted up the first plastic sheet that came up over the greenhouse. The second one was more of a problem because you couldn't come up from the inside now because there was already a sheet in place. So we did the tennis ball thing again, threw those ones over, and it slid right over, and it was great. And we tied it all down, and there was our greenhouse. And I mean, we just sat there. We couldn't believe that we had done it. We hadn't done something like that before. Anyway, it was done. And then the next few weeks and months were taken up with, we had to provide heat for it, for water for it. So Orzac, a London company here, and Vic Orzac, who's its head person, came out and saw it. He's done a lot of the machinery stuff for us as a food bank, air conditioning and heat, those kind of things. He said, "Yeah, I'll put those things in place for you." That was awesome. And a lot of other things happened then. The Ontario Grower Supplies, just down Adelaide Street from the food bank, they work a lot with plants and those kind of things. They work with farmers. They provided us a lot of materials and expertise as well. Anyway, to make a long story short, you're talking here probably around May or June that we were doing this. And we got it all done, and then we had to begin the growing. So seeds were supplied by various groups. Also, Luis and I, we went out and we started building all of these raised tables that are about this size here, in order so the volunteers didn't have to work in the ground. They could work above the ground and not hurt their backs or whatever. So we spread those all through the greenhouse. And then we began the process of growing. And I will have to say that of all the projects that we have been involved with in the food bank for almost 40 years, this one has probably been the most popular. Now, there were some that were dubious as to whether the food bank should be doing that, but we really felt that the public was looking for something. A number of different things, but this was one of them. Lots of Londoners were working in their backyards during the pandemic and in their gardens, or they were working in community gardens out in the city, who were looking for opportunities to get involved, but were also looking for organizations that would even emphasize more the need for urban agriculture, the need for growing food within the city. And the food bank took that seriously. Although we weren't a growing group that did that kind of thing, like groups like Urban Roots and others do, we nevertheless went ahead because we had the lead at that moment in the city because we had remained open. And we realized that we weren't just representing Londoners or representing the food bank. We were representing Londoners, farmers, growers, gardeners, and others who were really inclined to try to move London in this direction of urban farming. And it worked. And I've got to tell you, it was like a spaceship had landed there. I remember I went there one evening in the summer. It must have been about 10 o'clock. And it looked like a spaceship at the back of the food bank. This beautiful looking piece. It was just, and the street lights and others were filtering through it. And it just looked gorgeous. And then I went the next morning as well and took some pictures of the sun just coming up in the east and coming through the greenhouse. I mean, it looked wonderful. It looked like a Garden of Eden to me. Keep in mind, I'm not a grower. So, we plant a few things in our backyard and have a couple of raised beds, but nothing like that. So it started to work. And then the next thing, all these volunteers wanted to come. But there were limitations. There were limitations at that time that you couldn't actually have more than 3 people in because of COVID. But that was all that we could do, so we had to hold the volunteers off. The problem was there were so many of them that we decided that we would build the back area outside of the greenhouse into more of an area where outside stuff could be grown. And that's what we did, and we allowed the volunteers to be out there and to do that. And they came out in scores. I mean, it was a wonderful thing. The food was then grown, crops were grown, the food was then brought inside to the food bank and then handed out in the hampers that we gave people. It was quite a change. It was wonderful. We knew that we were kind of following the mandate of what other Londoners had been pressing us to do, which was to provide more perishable food to people. So that went great. Luis, we hired part-time then for 20 hours a week to help us to get this thing going, because I certainly didn't have the expertise. So while Jane was inside the building trying to do her best to manage all of the restrictions that had come from COVID and everything else, it wasn't easy. I was outside with Louise working on this project that London was growing increasingly fascinated with. So that was great. That was it. The greenhouse was built with the thanks of many, many people and lots of donations. I mean, it paid for itself almost immediately from the donations that came in. I'd say within 3 months it was fully paid off. So that was great. Londoners, as I said, were intrigued. Luis was doing a great job, but we then started getting requests from people to come in and volunteer more and more, and we just didn't have the capacity to be able to do that. So I remember sitting down with Jane one day and saying, you know what we should do, Jane? We should give small greenhouses to community groups so that they could grow in their area rather than having to come to the food bank. But what groups were open? That was a big part of the problem. So we began to focus on faith groups, because faith groups had 3 things that I felt were really important. One is they owned the land. It was private land, so these greenhouses could be put on it. Second, they had a group of volunteers who believe in this kind of thing and wanting to help. And many of the churches were closed down or limiting operations, so they were looking for something outside they could do. And then the third thing was they have an ethos, a kind of ethical view of the world that talks about cooperating with the Creator, the divine Creator who created this world. And they believed in that and celebrated it every Sunday as a congregation or as congregations. So yes, they had a real interest in cooperating with that Creator to get things done. And so we thought, okay, we'll begin to approach faith groups to see how they feel. There was just one problem: where did we get the greenhouses? So there were two people there that were hugely influential. One's name was Chris. He was at Lowe's down in Wonderland South. He was the manager. And I approached him one day. We had a coffee at the Tim Hortons out there. And I said, if we bought smaller greenhouses, how much would they be? Could we get them? Because there were supply chain problems, everything else. He really worked hard with his staff to find greenhouses that we could purchase. Now, these were smaller, much smaller, sometimes 10 by 20, smaller than this garage. But they were just right for the places where the churches were at and other faith groups. So that was great. And now how do we pay for it? And I remember the food bank, the donations had been so strong at that time that we could have done that. Each greenhouse itself, I think it was around $1,200 back then. But I remember I went to Wayne Dunn, who heads Business Cares in London. You will have heard of Wayne. There's 700 businesses that he gets involved every December. And they do this fundraising and food raising for the food bank that ends up with over $1 million worth of food a year comes into us during December, and that's through Wayne and all of his great efforts and his volunteers and his teams. So I said to Wayne, and I said, this is the kind of thing the business community, I think, should be involved in, right? You realize that you've got Londoners that are wanting to get out there and do it. Why don't you have Business Cares participate in this project? So that was businesses and citizens, organizations and others, and the food bank cooperating to do this while we were all stuck as a community. Wayne, to his credit, immediately said, yes. How much are they? How many can you get? So I think we bought 10 originally. And then I approached the faith groups, and then it began. It began with St. Aidan's Church in Springbank. And they said, look at, what we want is 3. We don't just want one. We want to build the 3 there beside the bog, beside the Sifton bog. And that's exactly what they did. It was wonderful. And then other groups came along and got the greenhouses as well. And the idea there was not that you grow food and then you bring it to the food bank for us to distribute. The idea was is you have hungry families in your area and resource centers and also social agencies who can help in that area. So take the food into your neighborhoods to those groups and get it out to people that are food insecure. And that's what they did. Now, one of those greenhouses got stolen. So that was difficult, but the rest remained up. In fact, Luis is just out this week because it's now been 3 or 4 years since they went out, mending some of the tears that have happened in them, and it keeps them going. And these groups have been fantastic at keeping the process going. So that food is also getting out into neighborhoods. We have no way of counting how much went out, how many people are volunteering for it, but I know when I drive by and I see these various greenhouses in the various places, I see people in them, and I see people processing that food and getting it ready to take to various community agencies. You see where I'm going with this, right? I mean, this was perhaps probably was our most popular program. And it was designed in the mind, or thought of in the mind, of a food bank director who had no idea what he was talking about, had never done a greenhouse before or anything that was like it, but who then turned around to community and said, help us to build what you've been asking us to do, which is provide more perishable items to people. And that's what we did. It's been a raving success. I mean, I was there just again yesterday. It's just, Luis is now with us full time, now helping other groups. We partner with Fanshawe College in that to do research with that. And much of the food that is grown in the greenhouse goes towards other agencies, helping them to grow food for their own supplies and things like that they need. So it's been a real flagship. It's been a great thing. But what I'm trying to say is, would that have happened without the pandemic? No. And not anytime soon either. I mean, we've been so busy at the food bank. We're swamped, 6,000 families a month. It's really, it's a lot of pressure on us. So I'm not sure we would have found the time to be able to do that. But the pandemic gave us the proper time. It also gave the London community something they could believe in. A greenhouse going up in that part of town with all the gardening and all the groups that were involved, and the ability then to give the best of the foods that we could get to the clients that really required it. It was a big thing. It brought us in way more volunteers that came into that area and really wanted to work. But I think really at the end of the day, it reminded the good people of London that, yeah, we're on the mat. It's hard. We can't get out there. We can't visit. Lots of places are closed. We don't know what's going on. We're reading in the news every day about what's going on, and it's really, really difficult. And but then at the end of the day, when they got a chance to respond, I actually see that greenhouse thing as them taking the lead. It was that person who phoned me before I even left the CBC building to say, I want to make a large donation to it. Other developers got involved with that too, making donations during that initial time. So it all came together very quickly, not because we did a program about it or any public campaign about it, but because the moment Londoners heard about it, they were living in such a tough time, they needed good news, and here was good news, and they jumped right on it. So we just followed them. Then we followed their lead, and groups like Leuna and others and the media that covered it. It was a fantastic thing. Maybe one of my favorite things that came out of the pandemic. But it was just another thing. It was another thing that elevated a systems-wide approach because of the food bank, and wouldn't have happened, because of the pandemic, and it wouldn't have happened without that pandemic. So it's there now. And like those other things, like the homeless lunches, like the depot system, like all the new volunteers that are in, it has become regular. It's become systemic. It still survives to this day and has all these little children, all of these little greenhouses around the community provided by Business Cares and the food bank, and food growing in there and provided into neighborhoods. You get it right. I mean, this was the pandemic that hit us all hard. And yet in all of that, nobody from any leadership point of view came to us and said, here's what you need to do to guide London through this. Londoners did that themselves, London organizations and London groups. It was a wonderful, wonderful thing that remains to this day. And I can't tell you the amount of volunteers that keep wanting to come and volunteer at the food bank or in the back area. That part has been wonderful. But also, I think just for us as a food bank, we recognized we're embedded in this community. When they say they want us to do something, we have to respond to that. And because of the greenhouse, we did. And we're able to, it's not just that we're providing fresh food, we maybe could have purchased that from other places. It was the fact that we were putting our toe in the water and saying to this community, yes, all of those people and groups that came before us that said that we need to start growing our own, grow local, grow fresher, more nutritious, make it more available, drive down the costs of food because it is local stuff. Those people who were at it long before we were, but we were now weighing in because of the pandemic. And because we had the public attention at the time, that's what we did. And now we have stayed with it. It's a remarkable story of the resilience of a community to find new and creative ways to move ahead on their own. Fantastic.